Yeah, I did change, and I'm really glad I changed.
This one's wife. Not Nigerian, not Maltese, but something else. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. You are familiar with this one's wife's assertion that she is 43% Nigerian, something which doesn't really stack up, as she seems to have confused nationality with ethnicity. Nevertheless, she has made great play of being 43% Nigerian as part of character trait acquisition and mirroring, despite many people clearly observing that she has only done this as of late in order to ingratiate herself with people of colour and, of course, to then choose to descend upon Nigeria and use up their resources for a private ego trip. Prior to that, she sought to tell the world that she was of Maltese ancestry, and we were treated to her trying to convince the world of this Maltese ancestry as she obtained a freebie, much to the annoyance of the Maltese Tourist Authority as she swanned around Malta, having photographs taken and making it all like a fashion shoot, rather than actually espousing too much of the virtues of the country that she was visiting. It would appear that this one's wife was rather confused as to where she comes from, born in the United States, but claiming once to be Maltese and then to be Nigerian. Unsurprising, of course, for a narcissist who seeks to be all things to all people and acts with that chameleon-like nature, shape-shifting in order to present what is most appropriate to a particular audience in order to pursue the prime aims. The Mail has picked up on this one's wife's exploration of her roots and talks about how when she arrived in Malta, she could barely contain her excitement when she landed in the land of her forebears, ready to explore and reconnect with her roots. The trip was mostly about trying to understand where I come from, my identity, she gushed after her 3-day whistle-stop tour. There is something so lovely about fitting in a piece of the puzzle. It felt like home. To be clear, this wasn't last week's much-trumpeted trip to Nigeria, where the Duchess of Sussex, who recently claimed to be 43% Nigerian, thanked locals for welcoming me home to my country. This was another jaunt, largely forgotten, to the Mediterranean island of Malta. There in 2015, barely a year before she went on her first date with Prince Harry, the then Suits actress embarked on a jolly to explore her ancestry in the land from which my great-grandmother hailed. Speaking of her visit, this one's wife said, "Before I came, people were telling me, when you go to Malta, everyone will look like you." And I started to say, "Oh my gosh, I do sort of blend in. And it's the loveliest feeling. The Maltese people have been so kind." Naturally, that was probably made up. That she believed, through the revision of history, that everybody would look like her. She doesn't look Maltese. But of course, the chameleon nature of her narcissism causes her to believe that she is, and that means that she will look like everybody else, or rather, everyone will look like her, because of course she's the most important person. The article continues by explaining more in a moment of her trip, which by all accounts was a delightful affair, featuring a luxury boutique hotel, a trip to a vineyard, and an impromptu photo shoot in traditional costume, all organised by the country's tourist board. More, too, of this one's wife's ancestry, which even to genealogists is somewhat muddled due to lack of documents and long-lost memories, or, to borrow an oft-repeated phrase first uttered by the late Queen Elizabeth, because recollections may vary. While the Sussexes' visit to Nigeria last week shone a new light on her African-American roots, The story of this one's wife's European ancestry on her father's side is equally fascinating. Back in 2015, then 33-year-old this one's wife was commissioned to write an article about her Malta trip for Elle magazine. But in the end, she chose to focus on life in the United States and finding her voice as a mixed-race woman. The Elle article, published in 2015, made no mention of Malta or this one's wife's European ancestors. I understand that in actual fact, Elle magazine discovered that this one's wife was making up her connection to Malta, so they didn't send their own photographer with this one's wife. When the Maltese Tourist Board asked where this photographer was, this one's wife then departed rather quickly, which means the whole thing got unmentioned in Elle, that the trip wasn't mentioned by them. Indeed, they were not particularly impressed with what she had done. Interestingly, when she stayed there, the photographer that had to be used, not the one that was meant to come with Elle, was one that was commissioned by the Malta Tourism Authority. He was called Kurt Arrigo, and he said, to be honest, I had no idea who she was when I met her. Her fame wasn't what it is now. I knew she was an actress, but I'd never watched Suits. She was a bit guarded at first, but it became easier as time went on, and she relaxed. She was relatively easy to work with because she'd done modelling and photo shoots before. She knew what to do and how to pose and how to hold herself. Accordingly, the Maltese Tourism Authority had to provide a photographer after Elle pulled theirs, as a consequence of realising that there was the falsification of the connection, and thus there was no article that appeared in Elle in relation to this. This one's wife, of course, believed everybody knew who she was, and as this photographer pointed out, he didn't know who she was and he hadn't watched Suits. Naturally, that would have been disappointing to this one's wife, who believes that everybody recognises her, at least back then, and that even today, of course, that she's the most important person in the world. Now, the article then goes on telling us plenty about what she did when she was there, that she was accompanied by Gina Nelthorpe-Cowan, who was her then business advisor, who, of course, like many other people, has been disengaged from and probably wouldn't have too many pleasant things to say about this one's wife these days. And the article takes us around what she did, where she went, etc. I don't need to take you through all of that. However, what it does tell you about is the fact that her ancestry isn't from where she's originally stated. During the run-up to her Malta trip, this one's wife believed mistakenly that her great-grandmother, Gertrude Merrill, held the key to her Maltese connection, and after being born on the island, had emigrated to Pennsylvania. In fact, it was this one's wife's great-great-grandmother, Mary Bird, who records reveal was born in Malta in the mid-19th century. Her birth took place there because her British father, Thomas Bird, this one's wife's great-great-great-grandfather, was a foot soldier who was living, along with his Irish wife, in a garrison on the island. A few years after her birth in 1862, Mary moved with her family to Canada, thus ending her brief connection with Malta, but her British-Irish backstory is nevertheless fascinating. Thomas Bird was a private in the 22nd Cheshire Regiment, part of the Prince of Wales's division, which in 1860 was stationed in Beggars Bush Barracks in Dublin. In January that year, Thomas married Irish farmer's daughter, Mary McGaig, in the Dublin parish of Donnybrook. 5 months later, in June, Thomas Bird's regiment, along with the wives and children of many of the soldiers, set sail from County Cork in Ireland to Malta, which was then a Crown colony, and a key strategic staging post for British forces in the Mediterranean. Their families were housed in barracks in the Cotton-era district, were forced to endure conditions in which poor hygiene was commonplace and fresh water scarce. In the dry August months in particular, they were afflicted by sandfly fever and cholera. The Bird family are believed to have remained on the island until 1866, when the 22nd Regiment went by ship to New Brunswick in Canada. Thomas Bird is believed to have died around this time. His Irish wife Mary married for a second time in 1867 and had more children in Canada before moving to the United States in around 1881. This puts a dampener on the previous somewhat romantic suggestion, which emerged around the time that she and Prince Harry became engaged, that she was descended from a Mary Bird working as a cook at Windsor Castle in 1856. Her great-great-grandmother was born after this date, and her great-great-great-grandmother, Belfast-born Mary McCaig, only became a Bird when she married Thomas in 1860. Thus, the story that she had put forward in relation to an ancestor working as a cook in Windsor Castle was inaccurate. Furthermore, her suggestion that she had Maltese ancestry wasn't correct. In actual fact, the ancestry was that of a British foot soldier and an Irish farmer's daughter. Not as exotic sounding as being Maltese. But of course, this one's wife isn't going to let that stand in the way of portraying herself as Maltese for the purposes of getting that residual benefit of a jolly. But the research that's been undertaken by the Daily Mail demonstrates that in actual fact her ancestors were not Maltese. They went and lived on the island, but they weren't actually Maltese themselves. And therefore, it's quite entertaining that when this one's wife talks about how she felt blended in when she visited the island, the only connection she has with the island is that some of her ancient ancestors went and lived there. They weren't from there. But naturally, this one's wife believing that they were, and it was probably an honest-held belief, but it demonstrates the way that she acquires these character traits by suggesting that she feels at one with Malta, that she feels blended in, that people would say, oh, the people there will look like you, even though, of course, her ancestors were from England and from Ireland. Once again, it demonstrates the way that this one's wife acquires character traits, and in this instance did so for the purposes of a residual benefit, namely a jolly around Malta. When it became apparent, it was all about her being photographed and enjoying a stay, rather than actually promoting Malta as an island. Yet again, this one's wife gets found out. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.